Hi there, you're listening to the Estranged Heart podcast, and I'm your host, Kreed Revere. Welcome back to our returning listeners, and if this is your first time here, thank you for selecting this podcast to listen to. As we begin today's episode, I invite you to grab a cup of coffee or tea, settle in, and listen with an open heart. But first, the regular disclaimer. I am not a licensed therapist or counselor. Nothing within this podcast should be considered or taken as therapy. If you are in need of therapeutic support such as counseling, please seek out a therapist near you. Hi there, me again, back with a couple of reminders and an announcement. The next round of Zoom support groups will be starting mid to late June. So if you're interested in joining a new cohort, please let me know. If you are an estranged mom, a recently reconciled mom, or an estranged adult child, I have groups for all three of those. And then newer groups that will begin if there's enough interest, and I believe that there will be. But if you are a therapist who is also an estranged adult child or an estranged parent, and you would like to join a support group, please let me know. I'm happy to send out information for each of these groups and an application and get you into the next cohorts that will begin again mid to late June. And so that's about 4 weeks away. And that email address is theestrangedheart@gmail.com. Also, a new service that I am offering is if you have correspondence from your adult child, if you're a parent and have correspondence from an adult child, and you can't make heads or tails out of it, or it angers you and you're not able to kind of see the forest for the trees, or if it throws you into despair and you're not able to look at it objectively to know what your adult child is asking for, reach out and let me know. I'm happy to walk you through that. This is something I offer to my coaching clients. It's something I can do for support group members. But if you're not interested in becoming a coaching client or joining a support group and would like this service as well, please let me know. I hear from parents when I work with them and am able to look at the correspondence from the adult child. It's very common for the parent to say to me, "Oh my gosh, how did you pull that out of this? I've read this letter, 100 times and I never saw that. I never thought of that," type thing. And what I always tell them is, you're too emotionally in it. And I can look at it from a more objective stance. And so that tends to get parents moving in a different direction, and it seems to be helpful for them. So if that is of interest to you, please let me know. Send me an email, theestrangedheart@gmail.com. I'll send you a link, or you can go onto the website and sign up for a coaching session, and we can walk through the steps for this, and then I'll have you send me the correspondence. Okay, please do not send me correspondence by email and just ask me to review it and then get back to you. This is a service, and I do want to have a conversation before we enter into this, because there's a little bit of history that I need to gain, and a little bit of an understanding on where you're at as a parent and how I can best help support you by reading this correspondence and then how to present it to you. And finally, if you are looking for coaching support, I'm full for the month of May, but if you're interested in starting in June, I have 3 openings in June. So, and again, you can email me at theestrangedheart@gmail.com for additional information on that. So before we jump into today's episode, the quote I have to share is, Emotional connections between individuals are the linchpin of any community's ability to maintain pro social behavior, and the growing absence of those connections is reflected in social incompetence, estrangement, mental illness, and violence. And that is from Ghost from the Nursery. On to today's episode. Hi there. Welcome back to another episode of the Estranged Heart Podcast. Today's episode is titled Road to Reconciliation. And I want to preface this by saying, in the end, reconciliation does take two people to want it, right? In any relationship, for a relationship to happen, it requires two people being willing to come to the table. That being said, I'm also a believer that we can do things differently that will help the other person want to move from no engagement to some engagement and then on to full engagement. To throw our hands up as parents and say, well, they've cut me out and there's no option to reconcile because they won't sit down and talk to me, is not going to help move the needle on reconciliation. If anything, your child gets the message that they don't matter to you. No, you cannot literally force a change in them. Just like we cannot force a garden to grow. We can't go sit out in the garden and force the seedlings to sprout and grow. But we can do things that will help make the ground fertile, that will help nurture the plants, the seedlings, to sprout and to grow into healthy plants. And that's what I'm talking about here in today's episode. I could not have reconciled with my daughters if they were absolutely against reconciliation. I could not force that to happen on my own. But what I did have control over was making changes within me that nurtured a fertile ground, relationship ground, for my girls to want to crack open the door, to peek outside, and to kind of see the sprouts coming up beneath the surface of the ground, right? If we use the garden analogy. So I just want to start that off because this is what I hear so many times from estranged parents. This is what I read in the groups for estranged parents is, well, they've cut me off, and so there's nothing I can do. The ball's in their court. They've got to fix this. And I don't agree with that. I absolutely do not agree with that. I wouldn't agree to that if it were a romantic relationship or a relationship with friendships, right? What I do agree with is at least one party trying to work on themselves enough to make the ground fertile and nurturing to encourage the other person to want to return. Okay, this is what happens when there is adultery in within a marriage, right? Yes, one person could walk off and say, I'm done. I'm done. I'm not talking to you. This relationship is over. End of story. And they could go on their separate way. And that person who had the affair can potentially help that other person to to stop them from leaving, or if they've left, to potentially come back by saying, I recognize where I went wrong, humbling themselves to say, I recognize where I went wrong, taking accountability, apologizing, and changing behavior so as to not repeat it. Okay. So I just want to get that out there before people start responding and making comments about, well, if my kid won't come to the table, there's nothing I can do. I just don't agree with that. And there's nothing that you're going to be able to say to me that's going to convince me of that. Again, yes, there are some adult children who refuse to want to come to the table, who will not open the door. And in those cases, you cannot force them to change that. However, do you want to sit in a space where 2 years down the road, 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, whatever, you say, I wish I had tried to take accountability. I wish I had tried this. I wish I had tried that to be back in relationship with my child? Or are you going to be on your deathbed and saying, I did everything under the sun to possibly encourage my child to want to come back to me? And that's a question that only you can answer. So, as I contemplated this episode today, I actually, it came about because I had a support group member ask me specifically to do an episode on this, to list out the steps I took to reconcile with my daughters. And so one of the things that I thought of as I was contemplating this, doing this episode, I reached out to my daughters. Now again, we were, 4 years reconciled before we had, quote unquote, the talk to talk about why the estrangement occurred. And we've had conversations since then, kind of along the way, small incremental conversations. But I've never come out and just asked them, hey, do you think our relationship now is healthy or healthier since the estrangement? And if so, what do you think led to that? Why do you think it's healthier now? And so I asked. And that took a lot of vulnerability on my end, because even though we've reconciled and I feel like our relationship is healthier and stronger, there's always that potential that they could have a different perspective on it. But I will tell you that both of my daughters said, yes, our relationship is healthier today since the estrangement. And the reasons they gave were, we each have our own boundaries and the other person respects those boundaries. Um, we've each grown as individuals. So, in other words, my kids didn't grow and I stayed the same. I didn't grow and they stayed the same. We each have grown, evolved. We've each learned, we've each entertained new and different things, and we've evolved as individual human beings. And we're able to have conversations about the estrangement without negativity. So things aren't thrown up into each other's faces. We don't drag well, you estranged from me. Remember back when you did that, and you put me through hell about that, and those kinds of things. We don't look at it that way. We look at the estrangement as a period that was very difficult for both parties, and it turned into while it was painful, it turned into an opportunity to deepen and better our relationships. And finally, the last thing they said was, we're able to listen to one another now without getting defensive. And I told them that I agree with all of these things. They don't get defensive with me. I don't get defensive with them. I honor their boundaries. They honor mine. Um, I've grown, they've grown, and we're able to have difficult conversations without it always being a negative thing. So I just wanted to put that out there before I started going into the steps that I took. So again, if you've listened to this podcast for any length of time, you have probably heard my own story, so I won't recap that. If you want to know about that, it's in one of the first 10 episodes of the podcast, so you can go back and listen to those episodes. But this, when I sat down to write out the steps, it was difficult for me because it wasn't like a recipe. Okay, do step 1 and then step 2 and then step 3. It was very fluid, and there were lots of 1 step forward, 3 steps back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, that kind of thing. So I don't want anyone to listen to the things that I did and think that, well, she did this first and then she did that and then she did this, and think that that's the quote unquote recipe. The reason I titled today's podcast as The Road to Reconciliation is in part because when we travel down a road, sometimes we come to detours. Sometimes we have to take an exit. We have to go off of our scheduled path, and then we get back on the path. That kind of analogy is how I viewed what I did to help the reconciliation process with my daughters. Again, these were steps I took, not what they did. I have not asked them what they did to be able to entertain reconciling with me. I haven't asked them that, and perhaps I will at some point down the road, or perhaps they will be willing to share that with me on their own. But these are the things that I did. Again, in no particular order. Um, it was really important for me, and I didn't recognize it in the moment as it was happening, but looking back, I can see it now, is that I was very expressive with all of my emotions as they were happening in the estrangement. So I allowed all of those emotions to come up and out. Now, I did not direct those to my children, right? I did those mainly in therapy, but I also did some of that with some friends. Um, and I didn't censor myself. And I find that a lot of parents, moms that I work with, have a difficult time with this. And I know that that's in large part because the way they grew up, they were taught kids were to be seen and not heard. Suck it up, I'll give you something to cry about. So they stuffed their emotions, and so it's really hard for them to access those emotions. But it's something that I feel is so important, because if you do not get those emotions, all of them, good, bad, and indifferent emotions, up and out, they will come back at some point in time, and they will most often blow up in your face. So when I was feeling sad and depressed, I allowed myself to feel sad and depressed. When I was angry, I allowed myself to feel anger. I remember very vividly sitting in the parking lot of the post office one day, just cursing a blue streak with my parents about how I felt about my kids. Um, I tell the story about being in the grocery store and falling apart because I saw a grandmother with her grandchild. And I at that time was not able to see my grandkids. So I didn't censor what I was going through. And I feel that that helped me to not go into resentment and camp out there. So that's the reason I bring that up. Because if you have resentment against your child, it's going to make it very difficult for you to reconcile. They are going to feel that resentment, and that is not a feeling that anybody wants to feel. They don't want, excuse me, no one wants to be, no one wants to be on the receiving end of that resentment. So that's a reason why I feel it's important to get the emotions up and out. Second thing I did was I got support, got myself into therapy, right? And found myself with a person who could hold compassionate space for me and all of my feelings. So I was allowed to be in that space and be pissed off and angry. I was allowed to sit there and cry and have snot running down my face and all of the emotions. And she challenged me. So if I started going down a road of my kids can't stand me, my kids hate me, they'll never want to be in relationship with me again, I've screwed things up beyond repair. When I went down that road, she would challenge me and say, "How do you know that's for sure? How do you know that's a guarantee?" Right? So it started to shift my thinking. So that was another big piece. Another piece was what I talk about all the time. I got curious, right? I developed an insatiable hunger to find out why the estrangement occurred. And then I was open to discovering unexpected things. So I was open to basically unlearning and relearning, right? Um, the next thing I did was I did quote unquote the work. And I talk about this all the time. Um, I did the work. I was willing to face my past. I was open to learning new things about my past. So I learned about my childhood and how my childhood affected my parenting. I learned about why things were triggering me today and how they actually started in childhood. And so that meant that I had control and was able to make changes to that I wasn't stuck in my past. I didn't have to be stuck there. I was stuck there, but I didn't have to remain there. So I started being open to learning new things about my past. And then I was also, in doing the work, figuring out what my habits were, what my hustle belief was. And I say hustle belief, meaning, I think we've all heard, the hustle culture, do, achieve, 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 and all of these things. Well, we do that as parents as well. And so I was learning about my habits, and most of us aren't generally consciously aware of our habits. We just do them because we're habitual and we don't think about them. So I was bringing awareness to my habits and my hustle. And then I took action to take my life back, right? This was the thing that I did to, I'm going to do these things. And if it brings me back to my kids, then that is fantastic and wonderful. And if it doesn't, then I'm going to be able to move on with my life. Right. So I stopped what I call being spoon fed. I stopped believing what everyone else was saying. So the people that came to me out of protection, out of love and care for me, saying, "Oh, your kids are such brats. How could they ever do this to you? You loved and cared about them. You were a single parent. You made all these sacrifices for them, and this is how they repay you." I stopped listening to that. I stopped it. I told people, I don't want to hear that. Right? Now, in return, most people walked away from me because they didn't know how else to help me if they weren't coming to my defense and dogging my kids at the same time. Right? So there was that piece to it. But I could not tolerate having people talk about my kids like that. So I stopped being spoon fed. I stopped chasing them and started figuring out about who I was. I started looking within. And again, this goes back to doing the work, right? What is it about my past? How did I parent? How did I learn to parent that way? Those types of things. Um, I stopped making assumptions. And this is where kind of the challenge that my therapist did, because I would come in and say, "Oh, well, they're just going on with their life and they're happy and, they just don't care, give a crap about me and this kind of thing." And my therapist would say, "How do you know that's true? How do you know that's true?" And the fact was I didn't. I was making an assumption. And I see parents do this all the time, right? We're hurt, we're in pain, and we think because we're not hearing things that our children are just moving on with life and just don't care. But that's not true. Um, by and large, that's not true. Unless you see that, hear it directly yourself, or then it's an assumption. So stop making assumptions. Be selective in who you allow in your inner circle, so to speak. Again, kind of goes back to the being spoon fed thing. Allow, like, I narrowed down my circle. I only spent time with people who could help support me in ways that I found that were helpful for me. Right. And those were the people who were not dogging my children, but were instead validating my experience and loving on me. Okay. And I started listening to people who had achieved what I wanted. So I started doing digging, again, I didn't know anything about estrangement, didn't know any, so I had to learn all of that. And then when I began learning about that, I started paying attention to the experts who were saying, this is how you reconcile, right? And what I see often in the estrangement community with parents, and it just boggles my mind, is there will be reconciled parents who will, an estranged parent will make a post about, "I just don't know how to reconcile with my kid. I don't know what I could possibly do to reconcile," or "Are there any cases of reconciliation?" It seems the only posts that we ever hear about are, the estrangements. If there's reconciliation, I want to hear about it. And then those of us who have reconciled come in and give our stories. And then generally the next question is, "Well, how did you achieve that?" And then we tell them. And then the next thing we hear is, "Well, I'm not doing that. Nope, they made this decision. They chose to estrange. They can fix this. I'm not walking on eggshells to have a relationship with anybody." And, you know, you, that's totally okay. If that's your choice, if we all get choices in this, right? If that's your choice, it's totally okay. However, it's probably not going to lead you to reconciliation. I don't know of any relationship on this planet that allows you to get and do all the things you want to get and all the things you want to do without some sort of sacrifice or a willingness to do something else that you don't necessarily want to do because the other person wants to, right? So, um, I asked people. I started following experts who told me what what it was going to take, right? My therapist told me, this is something your kids are struggling with. So is there anything, and if there is, what can we do to help bring them back? Um I got comfortable with change. I've always been comfortable with that, but like changing who I was very hard for me. I was always of the mindset of I am who I am. If you like it, fine. If you don't, well, screw off. And I had to change that mindset. So I started being open to change. And I then also the another big one that I think really helped me was I began doing something in service of others. Now, for me, that was at the time I didn't know anyone else who was estranged, so I started a support group for grandparents, and then that led me to estranged parents, and then that led me down this road. But I started doing something to help someone else in a time in their life when they needed help. So it got me out of my head a lot and trying to help other people. So I think that that is a big thing. Um, yeah, I think it's a huge thing. So the next thing I did was I developed an openness to hearing the hard stuff. Again, a change in perspective that maybe what I was seeing and feeling wasn't necessarily always 100% on point and the truth. I had to develop a willingness to be wrong. That was a big one. That was huge. That was massive for me, where my kids were concerned. Uh, I, well, if I'm honest, I struggled with that with a lot of relationships in my life, and it destroyed those relationships. So I had to develop a willingness to be wrong. I had to release control. And this was a big thing for me too, being an authoritarian parent. It was my way or the highway, and I wanted to control their every move because what I found out in therapy was um, basically I was taking whatever they did, I viewed it as a reflection of me. And so, therefore, I tried to control everything they did to make sure that um, everybody saw me in a good light as a parent. And by the way, that's a narcissistic trait. So, I know that that's a word that we don't like to go down, and I don't use it a lot or allow it within my spaces that I work in. But I just want to just want to bring attention to that. We all have narcissistic traits, and so that was one of mine. Um, I learned to be patient. I had to learn to practice the pause. I had to learn and the stopping chasing them. I had to learn to allow them to come to me when they were ready. And I learned that that was a way of rebuilding trust with my children. I had to accept my child, and I thought I was good at this, but I realized that again, through therapy, that I wasn't necessarily so hot at that. But I had to learn to accept my children for who they were, as they were in the moment, regardless of what I thought they were doing was right or wrong, or, they should do it a different way, or making suggestions on doing it a different way, that type of thing. I had to accept them and their choices for their life. Um, I had to allow autonomy for my child. Again, allowing them to make their own decisions and then to accept those decisions, regardless of how much I may have disagreed with what they were doing. And I learned to hold two opposites at one time. And this is something that I see a lot of parents struggle with. And again, I think it comes back to their childhood when they were not permitted to challenge authority, that type of thing. But to hold that both and versus either or, right? So when they were young, when our parents were young, myself included, it was suck it up. So don't feel emotion and get on with your life. It was either or. If you're going to show emotion, I'm going to give you something to cry about. So I had to learn how to hold two opposites, seemingly opposites, things and work my way into that both and, meaning I can think that estrangement is wrong and my children can believe that estrangement was necessary, right? And I had to embrace making mistakes. And God knows that was something I struggled with because, again, it came back to how would people perceive me if I wasn't on point, doing it perfectly every time. And just as kind of a side note, that this is another reason why I do this podcast the way that I do, meaning it's not all polished and fancy. You hear the dog tags in the background, you hear me clearing my throat. I'm not perfect. I am a human being. And what I do in my life, personally and professionally, I want to be seen as a human being. And that means hopefully being given grace to make mistakes, being forgiven for having made mistakes, and things like that. And I cannot expect that from others if I am not willing to extend that to others. So, just as a side note. And then finally, well, next to the last thing is I had to bring forgiveness to the table for myself and for my daughters for hurting me. I had to forgive myself for all the things that I had done that inflicted hurt and pain on my children. And I needed to forgive them for having hurt me. And without that, again, we tend to hold resentments and things like that, and it just doesn't make for a healthy relationship moving forward. So these are all steps that I took, right? Now what did this look like in practical terms? It meant that when my daughter suggested meeting for dinner or lunch, I accepted. It meant that I showed up with my stomach in my throat and shaking, my knees shaking, and not knowing what to do, what to say, but I showed up anyway. It meant um, changing my behaviors and my language so that when my daughter asked why, um, I didn't run up and give my grandson a hug the first time we saw one another after the estrangement. And instead of saying, well, you didn't let me see him forever, so he doesn't know who I am, I simply said, he doesn't know who I am. I'm a stranger. And so I wanted to take things slowly. Right. So, and I was willing to take it at their pace. I walked on eggshells to some degree for 4 years. I hear parents say, I'm not walking on eggshells at all. I'm not. I've been walking on eggshells for the last 6 months. I'm not doing it anymore. I walked on eggshells for 4 years. I made sacrifices because you know what? My daughters made sacrifices to try to remain in relationship with me. The least I could do was to make sacrifices for them. Do I walk on eggshells today with them? Not so much. There are times when I do, and that's my own fear getting in the way. And so I work through that with my therapist. But I don't walk on eggshells anymore, not like I used to. And today, we've been reconciled almost 7 and 8 years now. Like, much longer than we were estranged. And our relationships are healthy and are continue to get healthier. And so was it worth it? Absolutely. Would I do it again? In half a nanosecond. Absolutely. My children and I deserve that. Today, I hope that my children feel that I chose them over my pain and my heartache. I hope that they feel that I choose them every single day now. Because I also know what it's like to be an estranged adult child and feel that a parent hasn't chosen me. I also know what it feels like to have a parent who at one time I didn't feel chose me, now chooses me. And it makes me feel like I can face anything in the world today. So I hope that's how my kids feel. The road to reconciliation is not easy. It's hard. Every one of my clients have sessions where they want to throw their hands up, where they're frustrated and they're hurt and they're sad. And we work through those feelings. And every time we work through those feelings and I meet them at the next session, they're so glad that they've stayed with it. They're so glad that they are exercising patience. Having support through this process, I feel, is invaluable. It's absolutely invaluable. And you deserve to be supported during one of the most difficult things a parent can ever go through. You deserve to feel supported. You deserve to be supported, not just to feel supported, but to actually be supported. And your children will one day thank you for doing all the things so you could have a healthy relationship with them. So, on that note, I will wrap it up for today. I do want to say that, change can be a catalyst for growth and healing. and is necessary for reconciliation. And let me clarify this, for reconciliation that sticks and lasts. Now, I can't see into the future. I don't know what the future holds for me and my girls. I feel like we will be able to weather whatever storms may come our way, because we've all worked so hard to rebuild a foundation that is solid and loving and compassionate and forgiving. And even if we don't weather that storm, I firmly believe that we have what it takes within each one of us to find our way back to each other. Because in the end, we're all humans. None of us are perfect. None of us can do things perfectly. Not us as parents, not them as children. But if we open our hearts, open our minds, and be willing to entertain unlearning and relearning, man, it takes us so much further in life to some really awesome, wonderful, phenomenal things. And that's my wish for you. So, if you would like information on coaching or how I might be able to support you, feel free to email me. The email address is theestrangedheart@gmail.com. Until next time. This brings this episode to a close. I hope that this time together was time you feel well spent, and that you are able to find some takeaway nuggets to help you on your journey, wherever you may be on your estrangement and reconciliation path. If you feel you've received something helpful or positive from this podcast, please consider following us, sharing this podcast with others, leaving a positive review, perhaps entertaining becoming a guest on our show, or following us on social media, on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok under the same name, The Estranged Heart. As a reminder, there is an online support group on Facebook. If you are a estranged mom who identifies as being spiritual and approaches estrangement with a sense of curiosity rather than blame and judgment, and desire to do inner self-work and reflection, please seek us out. We can be found at facebook.com/estranged mothers support group. And lastly, if you are an estranged parent or an estranged adult child and would like to have your story shared on the podcast, anonymously or not, please reach out to me via email at theestrangedheart@gmail.com.